Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Good morning, Josh. It's still morning.
Yeah, good morning. It's definitely still morning.
Late morning.
Well, it's morning still.
Yeah, after morning, but not afternoon. So we're back after a extended holiday hiatus. It's odd. I was thinking about the things that have changed and the things that haven't. From, when we were meeting, we last recorded, I think, in early December. Be that as it may, 2022 is upon us, meaning that in the Texas political world, a huge amount of everybody's bandwidth is going to be taken up by the midterm elections, primaries, March 1st, really very soon.
Early voting starts on Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
Sounds like a date.
Like, what a great date.
For some of us.
Nationally, most of the attention right now in terms of the election is being paid to the fight for control of Congress. In Texas, the main focus, probably at the media level is on the governor's race. Obviously, legislative races are important to people, in the business. Combatants, as a friend of mine used to call people that work in the political world. There's a good division between combatants and non-combatants.
Yeah. I'm a non-combatant, but I'm interested.
Well, we're sort of in the middle there. This person was a lobbyist, and he was kind of being disparaging about somebody's non-combatant spouse. So, but we talked a lot about the governor's race and the election in the podcast, and I guess this week what we thought we'd do was, take a first cut at the agendas that are likely to dominate both of the major party campaigns at the top of the ticket. And I guess some of the context here is there's a lot of news coverage, and we're talking to reporters, the kind of reporter attention ramping up for both of us, and as people start to cover the campaign and come back from the holidays, there's often a desire to say, what is this campaign going to be about?
Yeah, or every time a new issue comes up to get the question, so is this what the campaign is going to be about?
Yeah, this is the thing, right?
Is it about marijuana? It's like, no, slow down. It's not about marijuana.
So, as we've talked about this, and we're, sort of been gathering some data for a blog post or, a research note on this, it seemed like a good time to regroup on what the struggle over the agenda is going to look like, on the assumption that the campaigns aren't going to agree on that. The campaigns try to set the agenda to their advantage. And we should probably flag at this stage a little bit of a caveat, but not much really. At this stage, despite the fact that Greg Abbott has to be given a substantial advantage in any reasonably clear-eyed assessment of this race, in the general election race between he and probably Beto O'Rourke, the party primary elections still have to take place. And there's a little bit of an irony there in that the party primary election is a bigger consideration for the governor than it is for Beto O'Rourke. Now, there are good reasons for that. But there is I was thinking about this last night, there's a funny slight disjuncture there that's easily explained, but on the surface, I think probably to people that don't follow this, if the governor is so favored, does he have to worry a little bit more about his primary than the Democratic candidate does?
Well, there's a really, really simple answer that doesn't look at any sort of big structural things. The fact that, he has slightly more well-known and more well-funded primary challengers, right? And not only does he have more, well-known and more well-funded primary challengers, but they have been declared candidates for quite a while. They've been very active, especially, former Senator Huff Hines, more so than Allen West. But, that just makes a big difference. And if we were to go and even go to, reporters and people, even if we were to go to combatants in the process and say, hey, can you give me a list of all the Democrats running for governor right now? They'd say, well, Beto O'Rourke, Joy Diaz,
Right.
And then they'd kind of say, there's that Forrester, that guy's running it, and that's the thing here. And so that's one aspect of it.
Well, and I think, and then the other piece is obviously, given the relative balance of influence of the party, the Republican nomination is a lot better prize than the Democratic nomination, I would say.
Yeah, it's a much better prize because you're most likely going to win. But then the other thing I actually thought you were going to say there too is that, one thing that I think is, about the Republican primary that makes it a little bit more of a challenge or more of an interesting contest is the fact that it revolves around a set of disputes and grievances that are kind of perpetual in Texas politics on the right, which is basically this question of, well, who's the real conservative here? And even though Greg Abbott is clearly very conservative, and if anything, if you'd say that before this all started, well, there's an outside lane on Abbott's right where he could be criticized. I would say with the legislative session and everything that went on, he basically carpet bombed that lane.
Yeah.
So
I was going to stick with the lane metaphor and say, he's basically put his RV in that lane and he won't move. And they keep trying to pass him and he veers over into the other lane and then veers back over as people are trying to pass him. And so,
Should we do another one? No, that's okay. It's enough metaphor.
So I think it's good to have that out there because I think we're inevitably in the course of this conversation going to default to sounding like the primaries have already happened. Well,
and but just when we get to this, and we're about to pivot here to the more what we said we were going to talk about, the agenda discussion. But one of the things that I think the agenda discussion makes clear is there's sort of what we know, like what are the set pieces here, what we know based on public opinion data, what we know about based on how the parties are constrained that kind of can tell us a little bit about what to expect. And then there's a bunch of stuff that we just don't know, these sort of, things that could happen that'll affect things. The thing about, Abbott's position in the primaries, he's in a very strong position. But as we get closer to actual voting, is Don Huffines going to put down, $5 million on ads that make wild claims that Abbott feels he has to respond to?
I would guess at least that much, but we'll see.
Yeah, Alan West is very good at generating media attention and that kind of stuff. He has, I think, more of a direct line into some of the more activated, people in the party. Is he going to say something that is, again, going to eventually require Abbott to respond? So far, he hasn't had to, but that's kind of the thing that's still out there that I think, we got to wait and see.
Yeah, the Abbott campaign is, if the past is prologue for the present, the Abbott campaign will show a lot of discipline and have so far in doing a pretty good job of responding to the signaling without acknowledging them explicitly. So,
exactly. Well,
and we are now in the phase of the campaign now that, as I started with saying, okay, we're in 2022, we're now, this has been kind of speculative and pretty subterranean in a lot of ways up to this point. In some ways this campaign's been going on, pick your point, but, certainly since the early period of the pandemic when Governor Abbott responded in, what we, in retrospect, was a relatively even-handed, pragmatic way to the early stages of the pandemic, say March, April, May 2020, and then got punched on from the right by none other than Don Huffines and Alan West.
Right.
So this has been going on for a while, but, in the last week or so, we saw the governor do a couple of events.
Did it really actually launch the campaign officially?
That was, the formal launch of the campaign, at least as they put it, which
seemed
odd to me, but okay.
Yeah.
The fictions that politics, force us to expect sometimes, particularly campaign politics. But, Greg Abbott did a big event. It is his announcement that emphasized the border was in McAllen, I guess. Yeah. And West punched back at him right away in a pretty big way by, using his kind of vector as a, discharged former veteran or discharged veteran and former officer and criticized Abbott's border policies and the execution of it, emphasized what I think has been a very interesting story recently, that is the difficulties among the state and National Guardsmen deployed at the border.
Right, which is all kinds of cross pressures there.
Yeah, drug use, et cetera.
Right.
Poor conditions. The next day he did something on law and order and, kind of a public safety thing, but also made some comments on COVID. Huffines took that as an opportunity to, punch on Abbott's COVID response, going back to those early stages.
And that like encapsulates the difficulty
It really,
here.
yeah. Well,
It's basically-
but just to finish, just also, and it was interesting, I think, in telling that, Huffein's bid for attention was to make sure everybody knew that, he had not and will not be vaccinated.
Right. Right.
Which also tells you a lot. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's an odd litmus test we now face, right?
Yeah.
No, but I think that encapsulates the difficulty, right? Which is that ultimately, for someone like Huffines or West to claim that Abbott is not conservative, they have to say, well, wait, but 2 years ago, or, but Texas just got constitutional carry. It's like,
right.
It happened.
Yeah, I'd have done this sooner.
Yeah, that's basically the argument is, well, it would have happened sooner, it's just
that's pretty small beer. I don't
tough.
think you're not going to get a lot of traction on saying that. I don't think, but
And so I guess what this means obviously for both Abbott facing, I would say notable, but I don't want to be too mean here, but likely irrelevant primary challenge, and O'Rourke really facing. I would say similarly, nominal, but probably even less effective primary opponents.
Yeah.
At this point, I think what you can look at this and say, both candidates are really looking at the general election. What's interesting in some ways more so than anything is the general election has begun. And that's not, it's not an exciting observation, but it allows us to start to learn something. And part of the reason I think, we're interested in the agenda from our perspective is two things. One, it's first of all, it's about an observation about, let me say this. Why is it so important to me? I would say is the fact that it gives us an insight into how campaigns are looking at the electorate.
Yeah.
The issues they basically decide to emphasize give us a sense of where they see opportunities and where they see liabilities and how they want to form this out. Now, ultimately, the second part is that in all else equal, forget about the fact that, what percentage of people identify as Democrats and Republicans. Just think about the fact that, if the election is about securing the border, Abbott's going to be in a pretty good position, right? If the election is about shoring up the electric grid, O'Rourke is probably going to be in a much better position than he would have been. So this is sort of just the basic logic, but this is obviously a fluid space, and it's not like it's one issue, right?
Okay, so let's use that as a point of departure for sort of unpacking this a little bit.
Right.
So let's start with the preferred Republican agenda. As you say, immigration and border security. As we've said repeatedly to anybody that asks and to some people that haven't,
right?
Is the core unifier and the core issue these are the core issues for any Republican candidate, and probably in terms of this whole primary general election thing, an ideal issue to land on because it works really in a lot of ways in both the primary and the general election.
Yeah, to me, immigration and border security is just it's such a winning strategic issue, all else equal for Republicans. And I think, and part of it is, number one, it's, as you already said, it overwhelmingly unites Republican Party voters. 68% said that immigration or border security was the number one issue facing the state in October of last year. 68%, almost 70%. If we were to take the top Democratic issues and add them all up, it would take somewhere about 10 issues to get to 70% of Democratic voters. And so it just gives you a sense of there's no loss in focusing on this. And then not to mention the fact that that essentially people are going to continue coming to the border. The numbers are not changing. They're not going down in terms of the number of migrants being apprehended at the border. And so when we also ask, on this question, do you think the state should be spending more? Is it spending too much, too little, the right amount on border security? Voters overall are about split, but among Republicans, almost 60% say that we're still spending too little on border security after, increasing the amount we're spending dramatically in the last session. So on the Republican side, there's no lack of appetite for this. It's not going to go anywhere. The policy space isn't going to change in some way that's going to take this issue off the agenda. It's an albatross for Democrats, right? In the sense that, the Biden administration Texans have a very negative view of the Biden administration handling of this, Republicans overwhelmingly, but also increasingly Democrats too.
Yeah.
And the issue is just not a winning. Just to be honest, it's not a winning issue for Democrats. If you think, I was thinking about just the framing of this. Greg Abbott is building a wall to stop it. Full stop.
Right.
For Democrats, they sort of begin to say, well, wait, are we talking about asylum seekers? Are we talking about undocumented immigrants? Are we talking about the people who are already here but aren't documented, the people who want to come? And I mean, there's something I think about this morning, but I mean, it's an issue that kind of reminds me of homelessness a little bit, in the sense that for Republicans, it's easy to say, well, the problem with homelessness is having homeless people downtown. We need to get them out of there. Yeah. Whereas for Democrats, they say, no, the problem is really difficult. But if you're a voter and you think that this is a problem, whether it be homelessness or immigration, you probably give the advantage to somebody who has a seeming solution versus somebody who clearly doesn't.
In other words, there's dissatisfaction with the current problem from both left and right, which makes it a difficult issue to deal with. Even if Democrats or Democratic voters are unhappy with what Abbott is doing, or can be, you can put something in front of them, they go, yeah, well, that's not the solution. But still a problem.
But it's still a problem, and it's not clear what the Democratic solution is at this point.
Right, and I think that's going to be a real problem for Beto O'Rourke. Okay, let's talk a little bit about public safety, and I think this is a little bit more amorphous, and I'm not sure. I sometimes get the sense we're not maybe we look at this slightly differently, but it seems to me that this is almost just. This is almost like the reserve issue that for for Republicans. Abbott can talk about this. There are a lot of good touch points for conservatives that activate, a pretty well-developed partisan cleavage and, competing partisan positions on this. Some of this is very backward-looking in a sense. It looks back to 2020 and the way that in that moment, the back the blue, defund the police dynamic seems to have helped Republicans, particularly at the state level. They certainly talked a lot about it in campaigns. Republican consultants from Dave Carney down, were pretty clear that they felt like they had good polling on this, that gave them a good sense of where the general election electorate was on this, let alone a Republican electorate. And they still seem, ever ready to go to that issue. I think on one hand, some of it is cooled a little bit. I mean, I think, the to the extent that it existed, the defund the police moment has kind of passed, for the most part, and again, I mean, there are still elements of it out there, but that particularly
the residue of it still exists, even if the movement has
right.
passed.
But it's not as, and part of it is that, enough Democrats have, it's kind of become a very standard Democratic position to go, no, that's not what we meant. Well, and for a lot of Democrats, not all, but for a lot.
But that's why it's such a great cleavage issue. I was looking back at our data on what people wanted with respect to police spending in their local areas. And, not surprisingly, about 60% of Republicans said it, like their local police departments, they thought the funding should be increased either a little or a lot. But I think, a sort of simple look at this would be to say, the public safety issue is, it speaks to suburban voters. We talked about a lot of competition in the suburbs, and this is something that can kind of be a wedge issue among suburban voters. But I think actually, it's also a wedge issue amongst urban voters. And if anything, if you look at those numbers, what you find is that, there's overwhelming support for increasing police funding in rural areas, but just a little bit. But then there's actually more support for increasing police funding in and around cities than in around suburbs.
And among racial and ethnic minorities.
And among racial and ethnic minorities. And other people have noted this who look at public opinion about the fact that, the people, and we've noted this too sort of in Texas, but, the people who are sort of most gun-ho at the outset on sort of defunding the police were usually white liberals. But if you looked at the majority of Democratic voters who are non-white, they said, no, we don't want to do that. Now, this makes a lot of sense. Ultimately, if you think crime is an issue, you want more police. And that's true. And Democrats have kind of painted themselves into this, terrible corner on this.
Right.
And so this is an issue that, again, I don't think, it's just not an issue they have good messaging on. Because ultimately, for the messaging for them to become successful, they need a tragedy to happen.
Well, and there is an objective, or, there is a structural conditional piece to this, which is that allowing for the usual mystery of nobody really knows that much about what drives crime. Yeah. But, the crime statistics are showing more crime.
Yeah, 100%. And I think and that's the thing. And the truth is, public opinion towards crime and actual crime they don't really relate to each other. Right. But right now, there is more violent crime in America everywhere. Texas cities, other cities, it's going on. And this is an issue that allows, I think, again, for Republicans to be hypercritical of especially urban areas that tend to vote Democratic in the state, but to do so in a way that allows them to say, no, but we're trying to fix the problem.
Right. And not to kick the Democrats more, like they need more kicking, but, I mean... The modal position on this is not that hard to understand. Part of this does speak to the polarized discourse in the environment and, what's out there in the media sphere and, how hard it is to deploy nuanced positions in politics, especially now. It's always a little hard, but, it's not that, intuitive that people that live in, say, majority Black or Hispanic neighborhoods, want to have good policing. They just want the police to be fair and not abusive.
Yeah.
That's not very complicated.
But and I think if you just think about like a simple math problem here, it's like there's a lot more crimes committed in areas with high crime than there are instances of police, aggressively violating the civil rights of people, just by the numbers. I mean, this is just the nature of it. And so if you're in an area with high crime,
I'm not saying it doesn't happen.
No, obviously happens. Obviously happens. But if you just think about people's lived experiences, for the most part, if you're in an area of high crime, and even if you say like you don't necessarily love the police, you probably still want the police there to deal with the crime. And that's the thing that's underpinning this. It just makes it very difficult.
And so we've got a couple of other things and we need to move on. But for Republicans, I mean, what else is in the wings? I mean, obviously public education. There's a lot of discussion of this, both in the press, but, I've had a lot of discussion with kind of the consulting, combatants class, if you will, about the Republicans kind of using critical race theory, in Texas, in some other states, the content of instructional materials, books and libraries, as a Republican effort to take this issue from Democrats. And the Virginia governor's race was the touchstone on this. But that seems to be out there. I don't think that's set.
Yeah.
But I think it is something to watch. Anything else come to mind?
Well, I mean, I just think, obviously, continuing to attack the Biden administration, inflation.
Yeah,
I think,
well,
I'm not an economist, but I'll leave that alone. But I mean, you just expect that with Biden, with the difficulties of governing, with COVID, with everything going on, and, just the expectation that the Democrat, the president's party is going to have a hard midterm election,
Yeah, I skipped over that. That's obviously a major, the default is going to be, and it feeds back into the public safety and immigration issues. The default is going to be nonstop attacks on the Biden administration and hanging national Democrats around state Democratic necks.
I'll just say the one thing about the public education thing that's interesting to me is just, basically you take these two sort of issues really, which is like sort of race and social issues in America and sort of the rights of LGBTQ plus people, which you can broadly classify as like social change. And, and then you cross that with this issue of basically, well, what are parents' rights and roles in their children's education? And, the problem is that, for Democrats, I think, remember, this is the Republican, just as, you kind of apologize for us. These are the Republican agenda items. There's a reason these are the issues they want to talk about, which is because Democrats don't have an advantage. But on this issue with, parental rights, basically, you're forcing Democrats in the court saying, no, I don't think parents should have a say in their kids' education. That's the thing you have to think about how these issues work is that, there's a bunch of issues we're not going to say that either party really wants on the agenda. And part of it is taking that next step and say, well, what would you say in response to that?
Gives a lot of Democrats yet another reason to be unhappy with Terry McAuliffe, who helped set, not all his fault, but he did a particularly inept job with that. So the Democratic agenda, O'Rourke has clearly signaled this, I think, since the day he announced his candidacy and in what seems to be his stump speech since then. The binding concept of all of this is to try to, get voters to respond to an argument that the Republicans, but particularly Greg Abbott, has been a bad steward of what's going on in Texas. You mentioned grid reliability earlier and kind of the lead into this. Obviously, they are trying to lean on that. And data from our points supports what seems to be, I think, the emerging consensus. On one hand, Texans are concerned, right? And skeptical about what's been done so far. Yeah,
60% express disapproval in October 21 of how the state leaders in the legislature handled the grid. That includes 78% of Democrats, but also include 45% of Republicans. Only 31% of Republicans approved of how the state handled the grid. And this is worse than when we measured sort of in June at the end of the regular session. So, I mean, this is definitely a big area of, this is certainly an area of concern for Republicans. But I think, Abbott's made clear in this, right? There's a gamble here, which is unless we don't have a big storm and the power stays on.
I can still say I fixed it if nothing else goes wrong.
If nothing happens, then I fixed it. And that's certainly enough to get you through 2022, which sort of, speaks to why that's a good but narrow path, but it supports the larger argument of, do you like the way the state's being run?
Right. And part of it is, there's a little bit of a paucity of other candidates. Mm-hmm. And so, you are stuck with kind of gambling on this. The other performance issue is COVID response. Now, on the upside, we've had more than 70,000 Texans die from COVID or COVID-related illness. As part of the response to the criticism on the right, Greg Abbott has said very little about the pandemic.
Yeah.
I've not gone and looked closely at this, but, licking my thumb and testing the wind, I'd say, it's been at least a year since Greg Abbott gave any kind of major address or any kind of, commentary public event on COVID.
Certainly
and the pandemic.
Nothing comes to mind that wasn't, sort of in a more political direct response, as in, indirect response to the Biden administration vaccine mandate or something like that.
So, no, let's put it this way. Yeah, no public health address.
Right. We haven't seen him with the doctors somewhere, having a press conference.
But, this has, the Democrats have the same problem with this that they have with grid reliability. Right. I mean, or a similar problem, right? On terms of the reliability of the grid, in the absence of a more recent stimulus, you need something to activate that lack of confidence. And that's where the gamble part you mentioned comes in.
Well, yeah, I think, Omicron's really a great example of this right now. I mean, it's rampant,
right.
I mean, and if anything, depending on, your social circles, who you hang out with, where you go, it could either look like a ghost town or it could look like business as usual.
Right.
And so there is a certain amount, people have gotten used to this. So it's hard to imagine at this point what would be like the shock.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I say they're kind of similar, but not, I think the threshold, I mean, the similarity is you need something to really jolt people. The difference is that the grid reliability issue came from, one major event that is now receding in memory with no subsequent reinforcement.
Right.
The COVID thing is a little bit the opposite, in which people have become desensitized if you were already inclined to be, not especially concerned about this, or to discount the threat, or to see other things as outweighing it. Mm-hmm. And, as much as the numbers on Omicron have, sort of thrust this back into public attention, the interpretive frames of this from people cognitively have already been set. If you were inclined to underestimate the threat, or to see the threat as not that huge, or to see it as not that not as big a deal, or something that you're just taking into account in your normal life, if you're taking it into account at all, this isn't doing much for you.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the focus on COVID, again, I think it only makes sense in the broader sort of, the broader concept of stewardship, the broader sort of, I've been joking, but, sort of O'Rourke going out and saying, well, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Right. Kind of thing. And I think this fits to that, right, in the sense that, obviously, you take sort of the Democratic and Republican views on COVID and sort of the partisan polarization around the issue, and you say, okay, whatever, put them in their camps. But there are definitely, I think, a lot of independents we've seen in our polling over the course of the poll who kind of look at the way that, I'd say Abbott's response was clearly guided a lot by the politics around COVID more so than the science around COVID. And at some point said, well, this is a problem. And you see that in negative valuations. Now, the question for O'Rourke, it seems to me, is that attitude durable? Is it
especially among independents?
Among independents, is it determinative, right? Right. And, and part of that is, well, that's kind of up to the campaign. Can they keep that in front of people? Now, again, it's not 100% of the campaign. It depends on the people, too, right? It depends on what else happens. But I think the idea there is to see, can we keep this sort of mismanagement idea in front of people for as long as we can? And I think this also fits to the stuff we're not talking about, which is we're not talking about a bunch of the issues that came through the legislature, which I think, if you're Democrats, I think you may have at some point said, oh, man, there's so many things we can campaign on in this state. We're going to campaign on voting rights. We're going to campaign on abortion. We're going to campaign on guns. And we haven't really brought up any of those three issues yet.
Right. Well, and I think that's been out there in the O'Rourke discourse, and there are parts of that that I think are in the speech. The kind of Greg Abbott is out of the mainstream and not listening to Texans.
And that's the version of it, right? Is to say, because I think, again, this goes back to the whole why are we not talking about, well, look, does O'Rourke really want to litigate his position on guns? I don't think it's as bad as people think it is,
Right.
given the steps to the right that the state has taken. Does he really want to litigate, exactly where when and to what point he thinks, a woman should be able to obtain an abortion? He might, and he might have to, but I don't think Abbott really wants to have that conversation either. I think that kind of is an exogenous shock, as we say, that you throw that into the campaign and make that a big thing.
Yeah.
It's not clear exactly how, that's going to shake out for either side. And so for O'Rourke, the best thing is to package all that together and say, this like, look, Abbott's not focusing on the right thing. This is about stewardship of the state. This is about keeping the state as great as it is, et cetera, et cetera. What the legislature did at his prodding was way out of the mainstream. Do you want more of that?
Well, and it seems to me that, and it's still early, and we're still in the we're still in the primary phase. And as I'm just sitting here thinking about it, there's kind of a two-step message that would be helpful to O'Rourke, all things being equal. Which is another thing to consider before we get out. But it seems to me if you could say, as you were saying, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? I'm sort of making the campaign ad in my head. Block letters of, X amount of Texans without power.
X amount of Texans without health insurance.
Without health insurance. X amount of, Texans dead from COVID. What's his, own your record, a kind of own your record argument, and kind of try to make Abbott look like somebody who doesn't want to own his record and just wants to blame Joe Biden.
Right.
Why won't Greg Abbott take responsibility for his record?
Joe Biden's not the governor of Texas.
Right, exactly. So, now, do I think that, I don't think that's the magic bullet,
No.
but I think as of now, that's probably what they need to do that. And again, we always say this, that's not going to happen in a vacuum. I'm sure, I suspect that, the Abbott campaign will have gamed that out and will have responses and,
Well, and in some ways they already have, right? I mean, their first ad.
No, they're trying to get in front of it.
Yeah, I mean, the first O'Rourke ad, the wrong way O'Rourke ad based. Now, look, it's not like it's an amazing insight to say, we're going to call him a socialist and say he's,
right.
too liberal. But they are trying to get in front of it. They're trying to say exactly that, which is, I mean, you can say that, but look at the jobs, look at the growth, look at the unemployment rate.
Right.
Everybody's moving to Texas. This guy's going to ruin it.
Yeah. So I guess the thing is, can you redefine the it and ruin it? And that's a pretty tall order, given, a lot of the predicates. So, I mean, now we do all the caveats, which is, the context of this right now clearly, supports, is favorable towards Abbott, the same way it's favorable towards Abbott, towards Republicans nationally. The governor and Texas Republicans get to enjoy some of that. They've used their incumbency to secure their position in the electoral system and to, shore up their advantages through redistricting. And while one can argue about the extent of the changes in the voting laws, the changes in the voting laws that came in the last session, don't do anything to help Democrats and on balance advantage Republicans.
Yeah, and I'll just say this. They probably give it in reality, they probably give Republicans a slight advantage in the sense of, the effect on whatever the vote share might be is probably, I would expect it to be pretty minimal, just knowing what I know about the effect of these types of laws. But I think that's kind of the point here is that, this is a competitive state and we're talking about this. And what, I think what's interesting in all of this is the fact that, you can look at these agenda items that we've laid out and you can see, who the target is, right? Yeah. I mean, immigration and border security is a good issue because it unites Republicans. It's something that, he's going to be strong with among independents. And, there's going to be some Democrats who, if immigration border security is what they're concerned about, they're probably going to cross over, right? Public safety, similarly, Democrats don't really have, a good response to the public safety argument from Republicans. They have no response really to Biden, especially if they can't pass more laws. And if they do pass, a big, another big social policy, which doesn't seem like they will, they're going to have to defend it. So that's, there's nothing really there. Well,
I think what that all sort of elaborates is, that structural advantage in the environment is still there.
Yeah.
And, absent kind of some dramatic change in context or a kind of bolt from the blue, the handicapping on this race looks like it is. And I think that's, what I interpret what you're saying is that's expressed in these agenda items.
Yeah.
Right?
What's expressed to me, I think more than anything is the fact that both candidates know that they have the support of almost 100% of their partisans.
Right.
And we know from previous elections that support from 100% of your partisans and good turnout generally means we're going to have a relatively close race here. And by relatively close, I mean somewhere between 0 and 10 points. Abbott's not going to win. I'll say right now, I don't like to make predictions because I think it's stupid. I don't think, Greg Abbott's going to beat Beto O'Rourke by 20 points.
Right.
So we can kind of, I'm comfortable saying that.
But you can put that in your little Matty Iglesias style prediction meter,
80%
whatever they're calling it.
90% certain.
Pundit check that Dave Weigel. That Dave Weigel gets credit for doing. And I remember when he did that in Slate, and it was a big thing.
Well, I'm not doing that.
Well, I try not to make predictions, and I don't want to do that either.
But but the main point here it would make is that,
I want to do it for other people, though.
But you look at this and you say, public safety kind of touches the suburbs, it's kind of a wedge issue. Education kind of touches the suburbs, it's kind of a wedge issue. O'Rourke and kind of asking this sort of more general question. Look, Democrats are not voting for Abbott. This general question about, stewardship, it's reaching out to independents. It's reaching out to people who they're trying to define this election for, who may not vote regularly. And I think that all the activity you're seeing down around the border, all the work the Republican Party is doing all along the border to try to find new voters, to put local candidates up for local offices, all the focus that O'Rourke is having on the border this time as opposed to last time, that's all a reflection, I think, of trying to find, again, loosely attached voters. And the reason I just think that's important in this is that, one, it reflects the fact that they know how to turn out their voters, and that they know that if they do that, it's relatively close. So who's left?
Right.
But then I think the other piece of it is when you have loosely attached voters, what do you have? You have people who aren't really, they're not paying attention to it like us psychos. So this is why the agenda really matters, because for those people, when you say, if you don't really pay a ton of attention to politics, but you're going to vote in 2022, well, is this election about securing the border, or is this election about, bringing back, let's say, competency to state government? If it's the first one, you're probably going to vote for Abbott. It's the second one, you're probably going to vote for O'Rourke because you don't have much else.
Right.
And that's why this agenda control thing is so both important but also kind of telling.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it's also why we're seeing so much attention to even the hint of less loosely attached voters, for example, in the RGB, and that's foreshadowing to something we'll talk about in the future. So with that, welcome back to the Second Reading podcast after we've been on a little bit of a hiatus, but we're kind of back in the saddle now. Thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to our crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Thanks to you for listening, and tune in for future podcasts. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.